Okay, everyone's here. Everyone can hear me. Are we ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending our She Talks forum on Reclaiming Power, a conversation on human trafficking and violence against Indigenous women in Canada. In honor of World Day Against Trafficking Persons tomorrow, we are proud to be hosting this forum in collaboration with Aura Freedom International, a grassroots women's organization that strives to eradicate violence against women and human trafficking through advocacy and education. There are multiple categories of gender-based violence affecting marginalized groups of women and girls around the world. We have chosen to discuss the topics of human trafficking and violence against Indigenous women because they are the issues that affect Canada and directly the Durham region. As women are affected in these communities, everyone is affected everywhere. The reason behind our forum being named Reclaiming Power was to dispel the myth of female promiscuity and the misguided views towards their sexuality. Also, before we begin, I want to address the elephant in the room. I recognize that I am a man, but I want to show the men around me the power they have to help, not harm. And the most important people we can help right now are the women of the Indigenous community. To those women, I say this: I validate all of your experiences. I respect all of your stories, traditions, and beliefs. Working with men and boys will help accelerate this process in preventing and ending violence against women and girls. They can begin to challenge the deeply rooted inequalities and social norms that perpetuate men's control and power over women and reinforce tolerance for violence against women and girls. Now, we will begin this event by acknowledging that we are gathering on the traditional territory of the Missississaugas of SCUGOG Island First Nation, and this is covered under the Williams Treaties of 1923. This traditional territory of the Mississaugas is a branch of the greater Anishinaabe Nation, which includes Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. We recognize and appreciate their historic connection and contributions to the community, as well as the province and country as a whole. This place is and will remain as home to Indigenous people. Therefore, we must proceed with respect and kindness. As settlers, we recognize that acknowledging this land is just the first step of many towards justice for Indigenous nations. Now, next, I'd like to provide some background on what She Leads and Aura Freedom International stand for. She Leads was created when Enactus Ontario Tech was identifying certain needs in our larger social environment, and we noticed the lack of female empowerment opportunities. She Leads is a women's empowerment organization designed to connect and empower females in the Durham region. By giving women a platform to share their voices, we hope that she leads, she empowers, and she succeeds. Aura Freedom International, though, they seek to eradicate gender-based violence and human trafficking by advancing equity. Aura Freedom provides education, advocacy, research, and feminist movement building while providing survivors of violence and trafficking anti-oppressive, holistic, and trauma-informed support. Aura Freedom is a champion for grassroots action seeking to create long-lasting systemic change. They are of the firm belief that when women and girls are educated and empowered, they become powerful catalysts for positive change whose success benefits everyone around them. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I would like to see a show of hands from the audience. I will be asking a couple of questions from you guys, and there is a raise hand option at the bottom of your Zoom taskbar. You can use that to participate. Now, the first question is, raise your hand if you've ever volunteered or worked with a grassroots organization like Aura Freedom International to advocate for gender-based violence. Okay, good. Quite a few of you. That's good to see. Now, raise your hand or just use a thumbs up if you know that there are multiple forms of abuse outside of physical abuse. That's good to know. People know this. You see, because while physical violence is the most visible form, there's sexual abuse, emotional, parental alienation, financial, coercive control, and so many other forms of abuse. Now, moving forward, to give everyone an overview of how the forum will be run today, we have two guest speakers, one from Aura Freedom and one from Native Child, to inform and empower us on the topics of human trafficking and violence against Indigenous women. and this will be followed by a moving performance from singer and songwriter on female empowerment. At the end of our forum, we can have an open discussion, and we'll answer any questions or comments you may want to contribute. We just wanted to let everyone know that the forum will be recorded today, up until the final discussion part at least. So you should feel free to ask questions and comments freely. Now, we would like to issue a warning that the topics we're covering are very heavy. The following information contains subject matter that some listeners may find distressing. We cover subjects of gender-based violence and descriptive experiences of sexism, racism, and transphobia. Please take care of yourself when listening. We understand if you need to leave for your mental health, and we will be providing information in a MailChimp after the forum on how to access support through Ontario Tech, as well as other sources outside the university. Self-care, love, bravery, and resilience to you all. And before we start the forum, I'd like to start off with a brief breathing exercise. I would like everyone to gently close your eyes. So please close your eyes and clear your mind. And we'll begin a breathing in and out repetition for about 3 times now. So just follow my voice and do as I say. Breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth. Breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth. Breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth. Now gently open your eyes again. Now, without further ado, allow me to introduce our first speaker, Marissa Kokoros. Marissa started her journey in women's rights doing fieldwork with different organizations around the world. From her travels in sub-Saharan Africa, India, Nepal, Italy, and the Balkan region, and many, many more, she studied and researched social positions of women and girls in different places. Through her travels and research, she's made strong ties and fostered deep relationships with fellow feminists and women's rights defenders around the world. After a long time away from home, Marissa returned to Canada in 2013 and founded Aura Freedom International, plunging headfirst into projects and programs where she addressed gender-based violence and sexual exploitation. Her research on different forms of violence against women in Nepal has been recognized by different human rights organizations, and Marissa is also an active community leader within Toronto. She lends her experience at different projects around the city where she addresses violence against women and girls and sexual exploitation. And this is on top of work with Aura Freedom International. So please, everyone, give a warm Zoom welcome to Marissa.
Thank you, Abdullah, for that super energetic introduction. You really pumped me up. It's been a long day, so thank you so much. And I didn't know you'd be reading the whole biography from the website, so that's quite the welcome. I just want to say hello to everyone on the call, and thank you to She Leads for organizing this, and thank you to my colleague Melissa Compton, who is always ready to advocate for the rights of women and girls and Indigenous women and girls with us on these really important events. So I'm not gonna spend too much time introducing myself or speaking, because I think why we're here today is that folks want to learn about human trafficking. You know, we're hearing a lot about human trafficking in the news these days. A lot of it is good. There's some crazy stuff out there too that we're not going to be addressing today. We're going to be talking about true and real human trafficking that happens right here in Canada, right here in Toronto or in the Durham region for folks on the call in Durham. And we'll tell you a little bit about the work that we do at Aura Freedom as well. I'm going to be sharing my screen. Are we good, Abdullah? Okay. So what Aura Freedom focuses on is the prevention of human trafficking. We do some frontline work. In the past, I did a lot of frontline work, but now we are focusing on prevention. And we focus on prevention by advancing equity, as we feel it truly is the only way to empower everybody, all women and girls and all Canadians, to lead healthy, vibrant, and fulfilling lives. Because exploitation thrives in situations of inequity. The reason why we have gender-based violence and human trafficking is essentially because of gender inequality, racism, colonialism, ableism, and even consumerism. So by advancing equity, we will get to the root of human trafficking. And that's our focus at Or Freedom. So you introduced me. I don't think I'll talk anymore about myself. That's me in the middle with my mom, and I always love to honor her. A lot of the work that I do is because of her. And she was a single mom, and even though she wouldn't call herself a feminist, I think she is one, and she's my biggest inspiration, as well as my grandparents and my daughter there, and my super supportive husband, who has been there through a lot of Or Freedom's growing stages. So I want to just talk about something very important. It's a consideration. Or Freedom is a grassroots women's organization, but we don't participate in rescue industry activities. What does that mean? When we're talking about children, yes, we do agree that children and child exploitation and child trafficking, rescue is necessary, but we meet survivors where they are, recognizing their different backgrounds, where they're coming from, and the situations of exploitation that they may find themselves in. And you'll learn about why this is important, because there's a victim narrative out there, a sensational victim narrative, and it really limits the view of trafficking. And it also limits our ability to be able to recognize someone that might be in a situation of exploitation, but to you, it just looks like a relationship, like a really crappy relationship, but a relationship nonetheless. So we focus on survivor empowerment, trauma-informed work, and advancing equity. And it's important to distinguish between consensual sex work by adults who are keeping all the money that they're making, in complete control over their bodies and their decisions, and human trafficking. Human trafficking is not a choice. It's coercion, abuse, manipulation, and slavery. I'm going to, because we only have 30 minutes today, you're getting a mini training, and we usually do this in about 2 hours. I'd like to actually share a really brief video that I think goes over the grooming stages really well, and some other key factors and key indicators. So this video is by one of my colleagues, Ronelle Bruder, and she's also a survivor of trafficking. I realize I exited out here, so I'm just going to click there, and I will be playing my video. You may have heard of something. I know you can't see it. Bear with me. I'm getting there. I'm coming. Okay. Enjoy.
Hi there. You may have heard of something called sex trafficking. I know, it's been in the news a lot lately, and you're probably thinking it could never happen to you or any of your friends. But the truth is, sex trafficking is already happening across Canada. Young Canadian girls and boys, some the same age as you or even younger, and from all different backgrounds and ethnicities, become victims of trafficking. And most of them have no idea it was even happening until it was too late. My name is Ronelle Bruder, and I'm a sex trafficking survivor and an anti-trafficking advocate. So what is sex trafficking? It's when a person, generally a vulnerable underage youth, is lured, tricked, and manipulated into selling their body for sex to make money for somebody else. So how does it happen? It typically starts with luring, where traffickers will look for vulnerable young people to connect with. And this can happen anywhere, like at school, the mall, or even online. Something that seems innocent, like sending a message on social media, like, hey, beautiful. If they get a reply, that's the first step in the luring process. They'll try to learn as much as possible about the person and their life. This may not seem like a bad thing, but traffickers will use this information to manipulate the person later on. Next is the grooming. Traffickers will use all the information they gathered to play in the person's emotions and any insecurities they have, like problems with their parents, school, anxiety, or body image issues. Then they may get love bombed, Meaning, within a really short period of time, the trafficker showers the victim with attention, expensive gifts, trips, even drugs and alcohol to impair their judgment. Next is the manipulation and control. At this point, the victim thinks the trafficker is their boyfriend, girlfriend, or even best friend. But here, they'll really start to push the boundaries and pressure the victim to do things they aren't comfortable with, while slowly isolating them from family and friends. That's what leads to exploitation. This might start with working in a massage parlor or stripping at a club. They'll tell the victim, it's just this once, or think about how much money they'll make. Then it progresses into sex acts. And if the victim tries to say no or leave, the trafficker may threaten them or become violent. Sex trafficking is real, and it's happening right here to young Canadian women and men. So remember how trafficking happens, and talk to a trusted friend or adult if you feel that you or your friends may be in danger. And lastly, if something seems too good to be true, trust your instincts.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. Thank you. So that video is, we use that video when we don't have a lot of time because it kind of covers some of the trends and indicators and grooming that we'll get into later. Some trends right now in the Greater Toronto Area or Ontario in general are here on the screen. And this is really important. I just want to dispel some of the myths out there. And what we're seeing, a lot of stuff on Instagram, sensationalizing what trafficking really is. You know, think of the movie Taken, right? That's that quintessential Hollywood trafficking movie where Liam Neeson is going after his daughter, I guess, and girls are being kidnapped and moved across borders. It's problematic. The movie, I guess, is entertaining, but those situations of trafficking are actually a really small percentage of what we see on the front line. What we see on the front line are traffickers and victims are actually getting younger and younger. I've been called to schools where classmates are pimping each other out for money, or the young boys in the class are doing it for notoriety or as a way to validate their masculinity. We see traffickers being men, but more women and girls working alongside traffickers. Many times they are also being exploited, and that recruitment stage is part of the spectrum of exploitation, but it, still nonetheless, women and girls can also traffic others. The internet is by far the most popular way to lure and target victims. They are recruited from TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and we have a whole internet safety portion which we can't get into today, but that's definitely something that all caregivers should be aware of. Airbnbs are increasingly used by traffickers. Hotels have become savvy. We've given training to hotels, and some hotels are tuning in and figuring out what's going on. So things are moved to private residences, hotel parties, all age parties, being paid to party. These type of things are things to look out for. Uber, Aura Freedom did a huge consultation for Uber last year, telling them how to make their platform safer because traffickers and pimps are using Uber to move their girls or youth around the city or the province. And it's problematic. So they've been given some anti-trafficking training, and there are some hotline numbers now that are available in some Uber cars, and there's a few new features. Sex buyers are not creepy old men waiting in an alleyway. Sex buyers can be anyone, can be fellow students, can be dads, teachers. We're not here to tell everyone what a sex buyer looks like. We're concerned when sex buyers know that survivors are underage, survivors are being coerced, survivors have visible physical abuse on their bodies, survivors are not healthy. These are the sex buyers that we want to talk about today. We don't want to get into a big debate about sex buyers. And in most cases, the trafficker is someone you know. Family member in some cases, but mostly they will be friends or boyfriends. Which brings me to the luring and grooming stage. The first stage is targeting the victim. In this stage, the trafficker is going to find the crack in the surface of the survivor, whatever that is. Whether the crack is that they're from a marginalized community and don't have social supports, that they are living in poverty because they're in a marginalized community, because that young woman or girl might not like the way she looks. They might not have any family or any friends at all. So they're gonna find that crack and they're gonna get in. Then they're gonna gain trust. They're gonna gain information. They're gonna collect information. Where does your family live? Where does your little brother play after school? All the information. They might even take, you know, if this is the beginning of a relationship, they might take some pictures of you and keep them on their phone to use to threaten you with later, or ask you for pics online, for, you know, sexy pics or risque pics. They're gaining information to use later. Then they're gonna fill a need. This is that love bombing. This is that honeymoon stage. Some of the survivors I've worked with have said, Marissa, I've still yet to get back to the place, that place where I felt that much love and enjoyment. That love bombing honeymoon stage is tactical, it is calculated, and it is done in a way where anyone, especially those with vulnerabilities, but anyone would just want to be around this person and do anything for this person all the time. And then the isolation happens quickly, in some cases, but in others slowly taking you away from your family, vilifying your family members or friends who really weren't that bad to you, manipulating you through abuse, of course, physical abuse, but sometimes the first or second physical episodes of violence are so bad that it will keep the young person right where they are, just out of fear of going through that physical violence again. It doesn't always happen. And again, these people, these youth, these human beings are not chained to beds like we see in, you know, movies and things. The chains are up here because the isolation and the manipulation is so powerful. The trauma bonds that are formed are so powerful that they're not going anywhere. One of the young ladies that I'm still working with now said, the door was wide open for me to walk out. I would have never, ever walked out. They had too much on me. I loved them too much, or felt that I loved them too much. And after everything I went through, I thought, who else would accept me back? So it's really important. And then recruitment, if you end up staying with a trafficker long enough, you kind of move up in the ranks. And if you don't want to take clients anymore all day, which is basically repeated rape for profit, you're not consenting to what's happening to you, you would really agree on recruiting other young girls. And, you know, we can pass judgment on folks who do that, but I know myself, and if I was living in that hell, I might just start recruiting others to stop it for myself as well. So many of the youth that I've worked with and that we've worked with at Our Freedom felt that the abuse was their fault because they actually never said no, okay? But the truth is that this exploitation is a slow process of coercion and manipulation. And this is exactly why consent and healthy relationship information for young people is so important. I think it can save lives, and I know I see Mel shaking her head. It can really save lives if we truly know what consent is. And although anyone can be trafficked, including boys and youth from, you know, affluent families or good neighborhoods, whatever that means, there are some vulnerabilities that make others more targeted. A high-risk childhood, a high-risk environment, and high-risk moments. Now, you can see these three columns. I won't go into them tonight, but at any time in your life, you can kind of find yourself in one, two, or all three of these columns, even if you haven't been through sexual abuse as a child, which is a huge indicator. But, you know, just entering the teen years, that weird, horrible stage where no one really understands, and we still, parents still kind of, you know, there's a stigma to the teen years. isolation, entering into your first intimate relationship, not knowing what a good relationship looks like because you never saw one at home. Community trauma, the marginalization of different communities, which we'll get into and Mel will elaborate on. And of course, gender inequality. There's a lot here, mental health issues, cracks in the child welfare system, systemic issues. But the biggest risk factor still to date is just being a girl, identifying as a girl. The objectification, you know, and hypersexualization of girls from a very young age tells us that the only value they have comes from the way she looks or from what pleasure she could give other people, right? And so why is this dangerous? Well, this is dangerous because if you can dehumanize someone like this, then it allows you to be inhumane to them. And so women portrayed as sexy is not the problem, okay? That's not the problem. The problem is when you're only portrayed as sexy, okay? We have other things to offer the world. We do beautiful, amazing things in our communities, in our families. Women are sacred in most cultures, yet you don't see that in most cultures. And I'm speaking from my own Greek and Italian culture. We are less than. And those little things, those microaggressions or more serious abuse and inequality are the reasons why being a girl is still the biggest risk factor. I could talk forever on that because we are a gender organization, but we'll move on. In that same way, men are in their own gender box. And I'm gonna grab my charger. I promised myself this wouldn't happen. Mel, can you talk about this slide for a bit?
Hello, everyone. I'll introduce myself after, but yeah, so what Marissa's talking about is, as you can see in the images on the screen, is like men in particular and our young boys, a lot of the time they get recruited to groom as well as participate in the dynamics. But the idea of the fact that they can't show emotion and they have to toughen up and they have to be this big person and they can't cry and they have to be the tough person all the time, it's constant. Even in graphic novels, and I love that the imagery is here because in graphic novels, they're usually the ones with the armor and the guns and everything, all of those weaponry, whereas you look at our young women and our girls and they've got these tight leotards on with barely any armor, and what are their weapons of choice? They're usually lasers, or they're like something small, like a sheath. So I'm gonna send it back to Marissa.
Yeah, thank you. You're doing, yeah, exactly. So we know what this is all about, and this toxic masculinity is, there's research showing that it's directly linked to violence against women and girls, including sexual exploitation. You know, being kind doesn't mean being weak, but men are taught that kindness, or they have to kind of validate their masculinity through aggression and not through kindness, you know, and some shifts are happening, but not enough yet. And so these kind of gender norms really play into, if you work with survivors, you hear this culture, these gender expectations of what girls and boys and men and women have to do is huge in sex trafficking. And so men and boys, they have a role, they do have a role to play in all of this. Small microaggressions, you know, we give boys swords and Lego, build, conquer, and we give girls, you know, cooking sets and dolls. And not that I didn't play with that stuff growing up, but why not give your kids everything, a little bit of everything if you can, you know, give the boys a broom set too, and give the girls swords too, and see what happens. And this is how we start the revolutionary change that is needed. So Mel is going to get into this later, so I won't get into why Indigenous communities are especially and the most vulnerable communities in Canada. And to me, this is Canada's shame. And Melissa will get into this later. And I always love hearing you speak, Mel. And LGBTQ2S youth. So if you don't fit in either gender box, where does that leave you, right? And then what if your parents aren't accepting of who you are? There's your crack for the trafficker or for the exploiter to come in. or for you to find yourself in situations of exploitation. And even when you do try and seek out services as a queer youth, the staff, I mean, I can even think back to our own organization when we first started. We didn't have all the training we have now. Would we have been able to provide the right assistance to youth who came in and who identified as trans man or trans woman? I don't know. I don't think so. So compassion, equality, equity, and human rights is the way to battle any form of exploitation or marginalization. I see some of our youth team members are on this call. The marginalization of Black communities is something that we have to talk about, and how gender inequality is very much linked to racism. And that puts women of color at an intersection that is very dangerous. Because not only are they not valued for being a woman, but they're not valued or they're dehumanized for the color of their skin. And Indigenous women experience this, and so do Black women and girls experience this, and other girls and women of color. The impacts of colonialism, of slavery, yes, we are still seeing it today. And the hypersexualization of Black bodies, or fetishizing Black women. You know, we work with survivors, and they would, some of them would explain to me, and I've even seen it myself, where a John, who's a sex buyer, would literally be able to choose what kind of girl he wanted that evening. Do you want the Black girl? Do you want the docile Asian girl who's gonna let you do everything to her? Do you want the pretty blonde white girl next door? Do you want the Indigenous girl who you could be extra violent with? There's a list that people could go through. This is what's happening in Canada in 2020. So what does all of this have to do with human trafficking, all of this anti-oppression? Well, if you know the root causes of exploitation, and we work towards equity for everybody, we can empower young people to demand better for themselves. We can value them and know, and they can know that they're worth a better life, that they can know their worth in general. And this creates a different narrative. And it really, really does make a difference. I've seen the change that even just our youth team presentations make in one single day. So sometimes we get questions like, why don't they just leave? You know, here's a plethora of reasons why. The biggest thing is fear, right? Fear of going back to your family, you know, and there's the stigma of women and sex. So how can I tell them that I've been doing all of this, that I've been pimped out? How can I tell anybody that I've been in a hotel room taking clients? How can I tell them that I actually never said no, but I didn't want to do it? How can I tell them that I actually love the person that did this to me? So the fear is huge, and it's what keeps survivors or victims in situations of trafficking. We prefer the term survivor when they exit the situation. I sometimes use victim when they're still in the situation of trafficking. So fear of violence, fear of harm coming to family members, someone seeing that video that your pimp took or your trafficker took, or fear of the unknown, right? How will I survive if I leave this situation? What does life look like for me now? How can I ever go back to a normal life? All I've ever known is the game or the life. And so many times, sadly, we see youth going back to their exploiters. We do, because their healing journey is long. And it doesn't happen, you know, like the rescue in the movie and everything's okay. It's lifelong healing. And some survivors, hey, they were on the street. So if I leave my trafficker, I'm at least in a hotel room, or I'm getting one meal a day or two, where am I gonna go? So services, right? Housing, all of these social services come into play. Now you might be thinking of someone maybe in your life who might be going through something like this. And there's challenges in identifying survivors of sex trafficking. there's a lot of challenges for parents, teachers, or just friends. You know, youth believing that it's their choice or their fault again. They've been trained to lie and misrepresent the truth. They've been trained that anyone who's not me is going to kill you, is going to harm you. They've rehearsed answers. They believe that they'll get arrested, and that is huge. Like they believe they'll get arrested for anything they do, even things that are not against the law. And there's shame and hopelessness, and sometimes they might not view themselves as victims or survivors, and that's right in the beginning still, because there's a lot involved. There's addiction sometimes, not always. Addiction involved, and I'm sorry, I'm in a meeting. Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you so much. It's okay. I put a sign on the door too. So, okay. People are people, right? We're human. So, receiving disclosures. If you receive a disclosure, okay, try and listen without judgment. Consider your bias, check your bias. It might be hard to feel badly or empathize or feel compassion for some of the choices that this friend or family member or person has made. Try and soften your body language when someone gives you a disclosure. Mirror their language. If they say their boyfriend, you know, don't say, you mean your exploiter or your trafficker. Just use the language they're using, especially in the beginning. Just let them lead, and you won't go wrong if you just let them lead. And never make promises you can't keep. For example, if they are underage, and many times survivors are underage, you won't be able to keep some of your promises because you'll have to report some of these things. And so it's a highly, highly vulnerable experience, and please recognize and honor that if you ever receive a disclosure. So how can you help or get help? Again, this is a very, very shortened version of this presentation, but you know, reach out to that person kindly and softly. They might not respond the first, second, third, or even fourth time you reach out, but keep trying. There are organizations in the GTA, in Ontario, even in Durham, that assist survivors of human trafficking and do actual frontline work. And Mel at Native Child and Family Services, they do a lot of frontline work there. Practice compassion, tolerance, and equality and equity. Speak out on injustice. And let's empower each other, empower the youth in our lives, because it's really, really hard to traffic an empowered youth. It's really hard. The trafficker won't do it. He'll just move on to someone else. He doesn't have the time. So kindness goes a long way. And there is a human trafficking hotline, that Canadian number there, which is a national line. And we did release a report this year, or Freedom released a report on gender-based violence, and human trafficking is in there in a whole section. The report is called Relentless Resilience. It was released this year, and you can download it for free to get into more meat of what we were discussing today. And if you want an anti-trafficking presentation at your school, at shelters, youth spaces, virtually as well, you can contact our project coordinator, Asha, at orfreedom.org. And I'd really love to thank everyone for being here and really giving a damn enough to be on this call at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday night. So I thank all of you. I honor everyone here. And that's it for me. I'm here for questions. I'll stop sharing. Oh, you stop sharing for me. Thank you.
I definitely have a question. So for someone, like, because we go to school, like some of us are in post-secondary and stuff, how do you know how to like support that person going through maybe a toxic relationship that's turning into that? Like if they're going through the stages and you're kind of seeing the signs, but they aren't. So what can you do to help them to maybe see the signs, or to remove them from the situation, or to get them help in any way we can do?
Yeah. Abdullah, do you want me to answer this one, or did you want to say, yeah, that's okay? Okay. you can't really remove anyone from any situation. They need to make that decision themselves. And if you try to remove someone from a situation, you probably won't be successful in the beginning. I think giving them information and resources and compassion and kindness is how you start. Listen to their story, honor their story. Don't ask any self-serving questions, like exactly what happened, like how bad was it, those kind of things. Just let the person lead and give them information on healthy relationships, what that looks like. There's tons of stuff online now on healthy relationships. You can find a lot of it, you know, but don't at the same time, so you want to be careful, but at the same time, be brave enough to say, hey, I'm not sure if you're okay. I don't know if you're okay in your situation right now. I really care about you. I'm always here if you want to make a change, or if you just want to tell me something, I'm here. That's how you open the door. You're not going to do it overnight. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Marissa. You articulated the issue of human trafficking in Canada with great clarity. And thank you for clearing up those misconceptions people have, especially from the spread of Hollywood and whatnot as well. Thank you for empowering survivors through your grassroots organization and being an advocate for change on this prevalent issue. Now we're going to move on to our second speaker of the evening, Melissa Compton, who you've already been introduced to partly. Now, Melissa Compton is an urban Mi'kmaq living in Toronto. Her spirit name translates to strong tree spirit, and she's part of the Caribou clan. She's currently an anti-human trafficking navigator for the Bikandadag program at Native Child and Family Service of Toronto. So Melissa has been involved in youth work for over 15 years, from camp counseling to program planning and facilitating workshops, as well as peer support mentorship, curriculum planning, and staff training as well. Melissa's work focuses on infusing her multilateral art platform with cultural teachings into all areas of the work that she does. Her current role as an AHT worker focuses on counseling and advocacy for survivors of sexual violence, alongside giving education and awareness on Indigenous worldview and struggles that are unique to the Indigenous population. So once again, please everyone give a warm Zoom welcome to Melissa.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so I'm not going to continue to introduce myself because that was done. I really appreciate it. And I do want to acknowledge the She Leads entity for inviting me to come in and speak, and Marissa, as always, for tagging me in on this piece. So let me just, I've got my camera part over top of the screen here. Okay, so when we run a training or any type of info session, we usually do a 2-day workshop. So this is me shrinking it down into a half an hour, and a lot of people who know me know that I like to talk and I go off on rants, so bear with me. I am shrinking it down and I may move quite quick. So just let me know if you need me to slow down. And this is just a list of who I am. So I work for Native Child and Family Services. I was previously the Youth Mental Health and Addictions Case Manager. I've been there for 5 years, and within the last 1.5 years, I moved into the Bikandadag role. What that means is being peaceful, and I do have a slide on that, but these are some of the services that Native Child offers. We are a dual agency, and so what I mean by that is we are both a child welfare agency and a support services agency. So my program is under support services, and this is what we consist of. So we have now recently expanded. For some time, it was just myself and my colleague Daniela, and now we've moved into hiring an anti-human trafficking case manager, an anti-human trafficking mental health worker, and we will be hiring an intensive case manager for our Scarborough location. And these are some of the services that we do offer, but primarily my role previously was doing intensive counseling support, as well as training and teaching and cultural components. I will be moving more now into program planning and curriculum development. So I'm excited for the change. So my role is to not necessarily come in and talk to you about human trafficking. And I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but my role is to come in and talk to you about the impacts of colonization on Indigenous populations. And the reason being is because in terms of Indigenous worldview and populations, I don't always want to focus on vulnerability, but that level is there, and it is always there. I have said that previously, when a young mother or just a mother in general is pregnant, that child is automatically vulnerable. As soon as that baby starts to form, that baby is already vulnerable. And the reason being is because we have something called the Indian Act. And I'm not going to get into that in its entirety, but there are some pieces that will be brought up. If you want to look at the Indian Act, please go check it out. It was developed in the mid-1800s, and it's been changed a number of times. So what I want to talk about is this wheel in particular. So the historical snapshot on Indigenous populations. So before contact, so you'll see number 1, pre-contact, these are the pieces that we had. We didn't look at having ownership over the land, over the resources, over people, over the animals. We took what we needed. We didn't waste things. If we hunted, we used all parts of the animal. But what's more important to that process is the fact that we acknowledged and we gave thanks and appreciated that animal for giving up its life for us to give us sustenance. And we didn't disrespect it by just, and excuse my frankness, but chopping off its head and leaving the carcass behind. And I say that bluntly like that because there's a lot of people out there that have hunting license or fishing licenses that do that to this day. They continue to do that. And then that sort of limits our resources in our home and the food sources that we have, especially in our reserve communities. What that also meant in our community is that our children were our bundles. They were a heart of our community. They were everything to us. And we knew by looking at those children that they were what was going to create the rest of the generations coming after us. We had empowered identity. We moved with the seasons, but we came together all the time and interacted. Some folks know it as a powwow. For my community, and being a Mi'kmaq woman, we know it as Mawiomis. You have longhouses, you have many different community gatherings that have come together. And we were held together by our teachings and our ceremonies and the sacredness that we had for just all of creation. Now, where it began to break down is when contact happened. And so you'll see here what I have listed is power and control. And that's evidently what it came down to. Yes, there was lands that were taken. Yes, there was resources that were taken. But what we forget to talk about is the fact that our people were taken as resources as well. Sorry, my headphone. Part of that process, and you'll see here, and I have over to the side, 1492 was the Doctrine of Discovery. That's when that was implemented. What that turned into was when, quote unquote, Columbus or the settlers came over and seeing that there was this vast amount of land, they wanted it. They wanted the resources that were there. They wanted the fish, they wanted the animals, they wanted the lumber, they wanted whatever minerals were under the land. But what that also included was our women and children. And that also included our men. We don't often talk about how our men were taken as laborers. They were forced into doing and building camps. They were forced into doing a lot of the heavy work. But what that also meant was that our women and our children were taken as property. They were taken as and forced into marry into these communities. Our children became their property. And that also meant that they can take the women and do with them what they pleased. This is 1492. You don't see a huge shift in any type of legal legislation until the mid-1800s. So how long did this happen until we started hearing things? And how long did that process, that seed that was planted by settlers, begin and start to flourish in all of these pieces of indoctrination and legislation? They began to displace our people. Oftentimes we talk about it in terms of the reserve systems, but we forget to talk about our settlements that were displaced, our settlements that were interfered with. Usually settlements would be placed along the waterways. You hear the James Bay Treaty, that's because it was along the James Bay River. You hear about many different treaties are named after waters, after bodies of water. And there's a reason for that. That's because that's where our settlements were. And what started to happen is settlers would come in and they would break apart. So say this was us along the riverbank, you'd have one community here, one community here, maybe one in the middle, and they would come into the middle and start to push us out and to separate us. They began to make sure that we couldn't have interactions with one another. And what that meant was not only were they here in the middle, they began to build their encampments backwards, from the waterways backwards, so that we would have to go all the way around or find another way to communicate with our other communities and with the other nations that were there. So that's the beginning of that displacement. We hear a lot about the Hudson's Bay. That was a fishery. So that is them coming in and taking over some of the areas that we use for survival. And then I want to briefly talk about Confederation. So in 1867 was when Confederation, or when Canada became the Dominion of Canada, and it was legally turned into a country. This was Turtle Island to us. This was our community, this was our lands, and I find it fitting that I chose to wear my land back earrings today unintentionally, but my nurse is like, let me see. Be Ripped by Saga, you can follow her on Instagram. But it's interesting that for a community and for a nation and for just a country that we looked at and respected and held huge honor to creation, that all of a sudden it then became Canada. There's a misconception that a lot of Indigenous people are Canadians. Yes, we were here and we were labeled as Canadians, but realistically, we didn't ask to be Canadian. Realistically, we shouldn't have Canadian citizenship because we never asked for it to be Canada to begin with. When you move, you'll see that there's 1867 was the Indian Act. That's when they realized that they could no longer, thank you. They are very pretty. Distraction with the beadwork. The Indian Act was needed in order to start to control us and to control us better and to actually punish us for fighting back, because that's what it was for. It was meant as a way to make sure that that power and control was being put into a way that they can actually legally do the things that they were doing to us. So then we move sort of into the systemic failure and the breakdowns of our communities. And the reason being is because of the genocide that took place. The original inhabitants, my Mi'kmaq ancestry comes from Newfoundland. My Mi'kmaq nation were not the original inhabitants of Newfoundland. It was the Beothuk nation who are eradicated. There was a complete and utter genocide on that province of the Indigenous community, an original Indigenous community that was there. And you see this happen across Canada. There's many Indigenous communities that no longer exist or are very minimal because of this genocide. And then it turned into the forced assimilation. Displacement again, and then disenfranchisement. So part of what the Indian Act did is it created so at first it was called the Enfranchisement Act. It turned into the Disenfranchisement Act because only one Indigenous person stepped forward to say, yes, I'll become quote unquote a Canadian citizen. When they realized that Indigenous people weren't going to step forward and give up their status for whatever reason, rightfully so, they then switched it. They switched the bill, they switched the piece of legislation and called it the Disenfranchisement Act. And what this meant was that any Indigenous man at the time, because women weren't allowed to go to war, and women couldn't educate themselves, and women couldn't go find a job. So the men in particular were targeted. And if you wanted to go to war, if you wanted to go to school, if you wanted to go and work off of the reserves, because the reserve systems at the time were starting to be put into place, you had to disenfranchise yourself. And what that meant was you gave up your status, you gave up your quote unquote Indian status, because that is also a colonial construct, in order to become a Canadian citizen, so that you can fight or go to war, or so that you can go to war, gain an education, or work off the reserve. But what that also meant was that you were not allowed to go back to your community. And so when folks would end up going into cities or other areas of the province, the extreme racism, the hatred, the blatant violence that took place, but then they couldn't go back home because they signed something saying that they were no longer Indigenous. So let that sink in. You still have a bloodline, but the government is now telling you that you are not that. And so you can't go home. You can't go where it was safe. This continued And so when women gained the right to vote, Indigenous women gained the right to vote later on. And even then, you were ostracized for showing up to vote. There was a lot of Indigenous women who, when they married non-Indigenous men, completely lost their status and had to move off the reserve. They were no longer entitled to what a lot of folks think are perks of having status. When those kids would no longer be status, if I was with somebody who was non-Indigenous at the time and I had children, my children could not be status. However, if the man married, and these are just facts, white woman, she would gain status and her children would obtain full status. And so if you look over to the side, I have where it says dilute the bloodline so there will be no more Indian problem. In the early pieces of legislation of the Indian Act, this is written in that. This is part of that bill. There was also forced sterilization on our women. This was prior to residential schools, but even during residential schools, a lot of our female survivors of residential schools were forcibly sterilized. And I know this is going to be hard to hear, but we know how to ration food, medication, and vitamins for our military because they tested this on Indigenous children in residential schools. We know the different levels of the electric chair and how it works and how it doesn't work because it was tested on Indigenous students in residential schools. We know how long children can survive without food and water because they did this in residential schools and tested it on our children. The line, kill the Indian and the man or the child, that was the exact goal of the Indian Act, and that was the exact goal of residential schools. And then you move in after residential schools, and just so folks understand and know, I'm pretty sure many of you on this call right now were alive when the last residential school closed. It closed, there's a little bit of an argument that it closed in 1997. Some say it's 1996, but regardless, many of us were alive during that time. If the same system was put in place, I would have gone to residential school. Many of our community members are survivors of residential school or have had impacts because their parents or aunties and uncles or cousins or any family member has gone to residential school. Now in the Maritime province is a little bit unique, not in a good way, and that's a whole other conversation on the history, the Indigenous history of the Maritime provinces, but my community, we didn't have residential school because we were so conformed already that by the time residential schools had begun, they didn't need it for us. We had boarding schools, we had day schools, we had camps. And so there's still a struggle with recognizing some of the boarding schools and the day camps that have occurred. And then we move into the 60 scoop. Please look some of these things up. Obviously impacts of child welfare and education and justice system. We are extremely, extremely overrepresented in the justice system. We are extremely overrepresented in terms of murdered and missing Indigenous women. We are extremely overrepresented when it comes to needing certain medications. And the reason being is because a lot of the time we go untreated. We are not heard when we access the medical system because of a lot of these pieces. Also, what I do have usually another chart that I bring in, but just for the sake of time, but I do want to acknowledge that under systemic failure, this was a number of years, like hundreds of years of teaching a society how to view us. Not only did this happen, but it turned into the Cowboys and Indians era. It turned into the Indians befriending the Pilgrims. It turned into Indigenous women being viewed as quote unquote squaw, which meant, and Marissa mentioned earlier, that in this catalog of women that a lot of Johns can choose from, is that the women, the Indigenous women they want to be beat. They want you to be violent with them. And where does that come from? That comes from hundreds and hundreds of years of this, of you have legal documentation in the early or mid 1800s that clearly states kill the Indian in the man and the child, and to dilute the bloodline. And in order to dilute the bloodline, who do you have to attack? You have to attack the women of the community in order to do that. And this is what happened. Then it turned into a cultural crisis. My grandmother refused to talk about her indigeneity. She finally received her status card at 80 years old, passed away a couple of years later, and at least 95% of her stories were buried with her. Why? Because she was ashamed. Why? Because that was taught to her. She grew up in an area where she was called a jacketard. Please don't repeat that as a derogatory term. She was also called a red N-word. This is how she was raised. And so when she was told, or when she started asking where she came from and who she was, her grandmother's or her mother's response was, "You're Newfie." That's it, full stop, "You're Newfie." You don't tell anybody otherwise. Because she could pass as Italian, she could pass as Greek, she could pass as Portuguese, she could pass as something other than being Indigenous. And that's what a lot of us did. I got the same response. "Man, where do I come from?" "You're Newfie." "Okay, what does that mean?" And then she'd say, "Well, you're Micmac." And really it's Mi'kmaq, but she refused. And then I remember her saying her one regret in life was her teasing her grandfather for speaking the language and not recognizing the importance of learning it and passing it down. But that's because she got beaten at school for speaking her language and trying to even communicate in that way. So when that's beaten out of you, you're not going to do it. Now connect that with human trafficking. You have a history of intergenerational trauma that is passed down to you that you walk with on a daily basis. You already don't feel like you're strong in your identity and strong in your culture, and that becomes amplified. And so this is where I talk about this cultural crisis, that it becomes a domino effect. It's a consistent domino effect through our families and through our bloodlines. And then because of this false narrative and this perception that has been placed in society, we are viewed as lazy, we are viewed as the drunks, as the druggies, we are uneducated. We're just trying to access the perks of the government. I'm sorry, but these were treaties that were written and promised to us for them taking our lands, for them taking the resources, for them taking our women and children and our men, for breaking down and dismantling our communities. And so if you're just throwing us on a small piece of land and then saying, here's some money to try to rectify that, to me, that's not even enough. You have many of these reserves that folks were placed on that weren't even habitable. We still, in 2020, have communities with no clean drinking water. We still have communities that have no power or have to go on power outages for a number of hours in order to reserve the power that they do have so that they can have it at some point. And so think about these things. This is why it's important to recognize and understand Indigenous perspective in the history, because then it translates into what we see now. Barriers to service is huge. I'm just going to check the time quickly. These are the things that you have to keep in mind. And what I do want to acknowledge is the positive things that are happening. So yes, we have barriers to service, but there's an increase in Indigenous spaces. We do have a lack of all of these things, specifically cultural understanding and safety and awareness, but there is an increase in this happening. And you see that with folks coming in, and Marissa is a huge ally for our community, and she doesn't speak for us. She asks me to come in and do this piece. Why? Because she's respecting our space and respecting our voice and trying to lift up our community. Accessibility can sometimes be a huge thing. It is a huge thing for especially our LGBTQ2S community, especially for our Indigenous and Black community, because that is a dual identity piece that we don't often talk about very frequently, and it needs to be discussed. Because not only do you have the impacts of colonization, you have the impacts of slavery that follow you. That is heavy, that is huge. But we do have folks regaining pride and opening up spaces and providing accessibility. And then we do have reclamation that's happening now. And we talk about the concept of the red road, or going back to the stem of the feather. And what that means is just going back on a path of reconnecting and reclaiming and re-identifying with your ancestors. So some folks ask how to support. We take a snapshot of this slide because I'm not going to go into it a lot, but learn, educate yourself, and talk about it constantly. But what you do need to recognize is that you're not entitled to asking us to teach you. Yes, there are a lot of us that are willing to do that work and willing to put that labor in, but this is re-traumatizing us consistently. I myself was not born and raised in the culture and in the traditions. I am learning myself. And so there was a time when I was people would tease me, and the community can say this, but I was an angry little Indian youth. And that was because I was hurting and I was processing and trying to understand the things that should have been a part of my life that weren't. I was around traffickers. I was around drug dealers. I was very close to becoming recruited. I was exploited in different ways. I wasn't trafficked, but I was around it. But the one thing that did stick with me, and I'm just gonna pop this up, I'm not gonna go into it, but the one thing that did stick with me was my mom had me at 40 years old. She vowed that she never wanted to have us, her children, go through not knowing what sex was and understanding healthy sexuality. And yes, the talk was super awkward because she's 40 years older than me. However, the one thing that she said to me was stuck in my filing cabinet in the back of my head, and it was, you can say no. And if something happens, it doesn't change you as a person. You have control over your own body. You can choose what happens to you. Now, she didn't obviously mean that in a very bad way and saying that I'm choosing to say no and still have the person do that. That's a whole other layer. She didn't understand that context. But what that meant for me was, yes, if something happens, I can still talk to somebody. I can still have access to people. And whether I didn't feel comfortable talking to my mother or not, I reached out and I was able to reach out. That also meant that when things did happen to me, that I knew that it happened to me, that it wasn't me and it didn't define me. And that's what's important, is things may happen. You're gonna have a lot of your cousins, your siblings and youth and all of these folks. It's going to happen. I think the stat right now is every 1 in 4 women you talk to have experienced sexual trauma or sexual abuse. For the Indigenous community, I think it's every 1 in 2. I can say I've been in the community for about 12 years now. Every single Indigenous woman that I've met has been abused, has been sexually exploited, has been sexually abused. That needs to stop. We need to understand these pieces. We need to recognize Indigenous trauma, the intergenerational impacts that come from that. And then that's all this to say is also recognize that we're all not just one nation. I associate with the 8-pointed star down here. Many communities identify with the medicine wheel. These are the Cree colors. This is the Haudenosaunee community. This is the Métis community. And this is the Inuit and Innu community. Recognize that we're very different. We may have similar concepts and constructs, but we are different. And so with that, I'm gonna say Walaliok, which means thank you. And if questions come, questions come. Oh, actually something that I know that folks did want me to bring up and discuss, which I forgot to mention, is in the early 1800s, the first documented case of human trafficking was Pocahontas. Pocahontas is not the Disney story that we all believe it to be. That is only the first documented case of human trafficking. She was a 14-year-old child. She was forced into marrying a settler and forced into staying within that community. And later her sister was forced as well into the settler community. This is a story of them being removed from their Indigenous homelands and forced into a marriage that they didn't want to be in. This also didn't mean that it didn't happen way on before that. This started in the 1400s. And so we need to recognize that. So again, thank you.
Thanks, Mel.
So thank you, Melissa, for sharing those insights and shedding light on the injustices still faced by the Indigenous community today. We wish more power to you for your continued resilience in helping survivors. Now, though, we have Raiza, who is a singer and a songwriter on female empowerment. She will be performing one of her pieces for us. Raiza is a badass female who's vocal about women's rights and believing survivors, and she's committed to the fight against sexism. She started to sing to heal her own trauma and quickly understood what a gift her music could be. Not only did music give her an outlet, it gave her a reason to live. Everyone, please give a warm Zoom welcome to Raiza as she performs her song, I Can't Breathe. Also, please mute your mics if you could.
Hi everyone. I just want to say thank you to Mel and Marissa. This stuff needs to be talked about. And you guys are going out of your way to help educate us, and I will always be thankful. So, sorry guys, I'm kind of awkward, but so I wrote this song after an incident that happened to me in January, but it was something I wrote and kind of just tucked away and like didn't want anyone to see, didn't want to admit it to myself. But this last week, I realized the importance of coming forward and sharing my voice. So, yeah, okay, I'm just gonna start singing. I'm sorry, I feel this way. I feel this way. I'm sorry, it wasn't my intention to do this. I never meant to hurt you. Is what you told me. And I say, fuck you. And your false ass apologies. Look at what you got to me. I can't breathe, I can't breathe. I trusted you, took advantage of me, crushed me so I couldn't see what was right from wrong. Don't tell me that you're sorry. Don't tell me that you're sorry. Don't tell me that you wanna be friends when you were being selfish. Don't tell me that you need me. Don't tell me that you wanna be friends. Don't tell me that you're sorry. You don't deserve me. They all blame me and know while you keep partying your cares away. They all blame me and say, why'd you go over there in the first place? They all blame me and tell me that it hurts them to see me cry, but they don't understand what it's like to not be able to breathe. I trusted you, took advantage of me, crushed me so I couldn't see what was right from wrong. Oh, I trusted you, and you took advantage of me, crushed me so I couldn't see what was right from wrong. Don't tell me that you're sorry. Don't tell me that you're sorry. Don't tell me that you wanna be friends when you were being selfish. Don't tell me that you need me. Don't tell me that you wanna be friends. Don't tell me that you're sorry. Don't deserve me. I trusted you. Okay, let me stop singing now. Thank you guys. I love you all.
Thank you, Raiza, for that uplifting performance. Everyone here can agree that you have an angelic voice. Also, we're really grateful that you were able to attend today and share your music with everyone. A warm Zoom round of applause for Raiza.
Thank you, Marissa. Thank you. Yay.
Now, before we conclude our session, She Leads and Aura Freedom International want to give a heartfelt thank you to all of our guest speakers for their time and valuable insights in this forum. Everyone, please give them a warm round of applause too. Furthermore, we want to thank all of you attendees for choosing to take part in this empowering conversation and for all of that support in achieving progress on this mission. Now, I also want to thank one of our most supportive partners as well, Brilliant Catalyst. Brilliant Catalyst is a cultivating spirit of innovation which inspires the next generation of innovative changemakers. If you want to learn more about Brilliant Catalyst, go to OntarioTechBrilliant.ca. And lastly, we will be sending out a post-event MailChimp with all the mental health resources on it as well, with informative links too. Now, it'll help you educate and inform yourself and inform others as well as those around you on these issues. The MailChimp will have social media handles and website information of all of our speakers, the hosting organization, She Leads, and Order Freedom International. So just click the links to learn more, as well as donate to any of the initiatives Order Freedom has going on right now. And before you all leave today, there's a quick and short survey located in that chat box, okay? We rely on your constructive feedback to continuously improve our events. If you could, please fill it out by end of day tomorrow. Now, thank you again to everyone for being here on this beautiful Wednesday in July. We appreciate your support and hope to see you all at our next She Talks Forum. Now, for those of you who don't have any questions, please feel free to leave at any time now. We will be dedicating the last 15 minutes of the forum to answer any questions you could have on She Leads or Order Freedom International or any of our guest speakers. Please feel free to drop your questions or just unmute your mic and ask directly.
I wanted to add something, Abdullah, if I can.